the morning they planned to take everything from me. I walked into that solicitor's office carrying a small USB drive in my breast pocket. I remember thinking how light it was for something that held so much weight. My name is Gerald Whitmore. I'm 63 years old, retired civil engineer. And I've spent most of my adult life building things meant to last: bridges, drainage systems, roads through the Queensland outback that would still be standing long after I was gone. I understood load-bearing. I understood stress points. What I never thought I'd have to calculate was exactly how much betrayal a man could carry before something inside him gave way. That morning, I buttoned my gray shirt slowly, looked in the bathroom mirror, and made myself a promise. No raised voice, no trembling hands, just steady. The way you have to be when you're overseeing a pour on a major concrete span and one wrong move costs everything. I kept that promise. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My wife, I'll call her by what she was to me for 31 years. My wife, her name was Colleen. We met at a pub in Toowoomba in 1989, when I was barely 32 and she was 28, laughing too loud at something her friend had said, completely unbothered by anyone watching. I thought that laugh was the most alive sound I'd ever heard. I married her 14 months later in a small ceremony in the Darling Downs. Her parents, my parents, 40 guests, a borrowed marquee. We had 2 children. Our son, Marcus, who is now 37 and lives in Perth with his family, and our daughter, Fiona, who at 34 still lived 40 minutes from us on the Sunshine Coast, married to a man named Derek Ashford. I need you to understand something about Derek before I go any further. When Fiona first brought him home 12 years ago, I liked him. That's the part that still sits in my chest, like a stone. He was easy to like, quick smile, good with tools, always offered to help carry things at Christmas. He coached junior footy on weekends. He called me Gerald. Then after a few years started calling me Geza the way the blokes at the club did. And I let him, because it felt like acceptance, like he genuinely considered himself part of our family. I coached myself to see him as a son. That was my first mistake, I think. Not because trust is wrong, but because I trusted the performance of a man rather than his character. And those two things are not always the same. Colleen and I had been struggling for years before the end came, longer than I admitted even to myself. The children had both left home. My work had dried up after I took early retirement. And somewhere in the quiet of an empty house, Colleen and I had run out of things to say to each other. I don't blame her entirely for that. I was not a man who talked easily about the soft things. I came from a generation that showed love by fixing the leaking tap, by paying the bills on time, by being there. But being physically present, I have since learned, is not the same as being emotionally available. We tried. A counselor in Nambour. Twice. A weekend away at Noosa that felt more like 2 strangers sharing a hotel room than a couple attempting to reconnect. By the time Colleen told me, sitting at the kitchen table on an overcast Tuesday in March, that she wanted a divorce, I felt more resignation than shock, like watching a structure you'd been monitoring for cracks finally settle into the ground. I think we both know this hasn't been working, she said. I nodded. Yeah, I think we do. What I did not expect was what came next. The following weeks moved in the slow, procedural way that divorce proceedings do. Colleen hired a solicitor, a woman named Patricia Lamb, out of Maroochydore, who had a reputation for being aggressive in asset settlements. I hired my own man, a quiet fellow named Ron, who I'd known through the Engineering Association for 20 years and who I trusted completely. Colleen and I were still living in the house, our house, the 4-bedroom place in Bouderim we'd bought in 2003 and paid off 12 years later, which was its own particular form of torture. Polite at the breakfast table, careful not to occupy the same room for too long. She cooked her meals, I cooked mine, and we rotated around each other like planets that had long since stopped sharing any gravitational pull. What I noticed, though, was Derek. At first, it was small things. He started coming around more often than usual, even on days when Fiona wasn't with him, dropping off something he claimed Colleen had left at their place, staying for a cup of tea. I'd come home some afternoons and hear them talking in the kitchen, laughter drifting down the hallway, her real laugh, the one I hadn't heard directed at me in years. I told myself I was, but then one evening in late May, I came home earlier than expected from a meeting with Ron. My car was in the shop, and my mate Trevor had dropped me at the end of the street. I walked up the driveway quietly without thinking about it. Habit from years of coming home to a household where someone was always sleeping, studying, or on the phone. The front door was unlocked. I could hear voices in the living room, low and careful. I stood in the entry hall, and I listened. "She's not going to say anything," Colleen was saying. "She barely notices. She notices more than you think." That was Derek's voice. "Fiona's not stupid, Kerr. A pause. Well, it's not like it means anything long-term. It's just, right now, this is what it is. Once the papers are signed and everything settles, and Gerald? You're sure he has no idea?" Silence. Then Colleen said, quietly but clearly, "He never notices anything. He's been somewhere else for years." I stood in that hallway for what felt like a very long time. The afternoon light was coming through the lead light panel above the front door, throwing small colored shapes on the floor. I looked at those shapes. I breathed very slowly. I thought about load-bearing, about stress points, about what a structure does when it's been compromised from the inside by the very elements meant to hold it together. Then I walked back outside, sat on the front step, and called Trevor to come and pick me up again. I told him I'd left my phone in his car. I did not sleep well that night. I lay in the spare room. I'd moved there 6 weeks into the separation, and I stared at the ceiling, and I let myself feel it fully. Just that once, because I knew if I didn't give it a moment, it would find a way to surface at the wrong time. The anger, the humiliation, the particular grief of discovering that two people you loved had looked at you and found you easy to deceive. Then I made a decision. I would not confront them. I would not give them the gift of knowing that I knew. I would let them believe I was exactly what Colleen had said. Oblivious, distracted, somewhere else. And while they believed that, I would prepare. The next morning I called Ron and asked him to meet me at his office. Not over the phone. I drove there myself, parked 2 streets away out of a caution I couldn't entirely explain, and I told him what I'd heard. All of it. Word for word. Ron is a man who has handled ugly divorces for 30 years, and he listened without expression. But when I finished, there was a particular quality to his silence. "Right," he said. "Tell me about the assets." We spent 3 hours going through everything. The house, which had appreciated significantly since 2003 current market value, somewhere in the range of $860,000. A managed investment portfolio in both our names. My superannuation. The small block of land in Kingaroy I'd inherited from my father in 2018 and kept in my name alone. 2 vehicles. Ron had already flagged that Patricia Lamb's initial position was going to argue for an equal split of almost everything, including my superannuation. "That's aggressive," I said. "What grounds?" "She'll argue Colleen made non-financial contributions throughout the marriage that supported your earning capacity, kept the household, raised the children while you were away on site. It's a standard approach, and it has merit. She's also been having an affair with our son-in-law." Ron nodded slowly. In Australian family law, conduct during the marriage, infidelity included, generally doesn't affect property settlements. The court focuses on contributions and future needs, not moral fault. I absorbed that. However, he said, and there was something careful in the way he said it, there are other matters that can affect proceedings significantly. If, for instance, it could be demonstrated that a party has been disposing of assets, or that there have been financial arrangements made in anticipation of the settlement that weren't disclosed, that's a different matter entirely. He looked at me steadily. I'd suggest you look very carefully at your joint accounts over the past 6 months. And if you have any reason to believe financial information is being shared between your wife and your son-in-law in a way that could influence the proceedings, document everything. I left his office with a list of things to do and a very specific kind of focus that I hadn't felt in years. Not the numb, drifting feeling of the last months of the marriage. Something sharper, something that knew exactly where it was going. What I found over the following 3 weeks was methodical and damning. Colleen had withdrawn $12,000 in cash from our joint account across 4 separate transactions in April and early May, before the formal separation agreement had been filed, but after she'd clearly begun speaking with Patricia Lamb, small enough amounts not to trigger alarm, large enough, cumulatively, to matter. I also discovered, through a very careful look at the records from our joint credit card, a pattern of lunches, dinners, and 2 overnight accommodation bookings, one at a resort in Hervey Bay, one at a smaller place near Mullaney, in the months of February and March. Dates when I had been interstate or away on site visits with a colleague I was consulting for. I photographed every document. I made copies. I stored them in 3 separate places with Ron, on a USB drive at my mate Trevor's house, and on a secure cloud service Ron's office used. I also did something that I want to be honest about, because this is where some people might judge me. I purchased a small, voice-activated recording device. I placed it in the living room, in the bookcase behind a row of paperbacks, facing toward the kitchen bench where Colleen and Derek always seemed to end up talking. In Queensland, recording a private conversation that you are not a party to is a complex legal matter. I asked Ron about this directly, and he explained the nuances carefully. What I will say is that I was, at all relevant times, a resident of the home in which the recordings were made, and that the recordings were used in a way that Ron considered appropriate and legally defensible. That's as much detail as I'll go into on that point. What the recordings gave me was clarity. In 3 separate conversations over 2 weeks, Colleen and Derek discussed the settlement directly. Derek advised her, and these are the words that have stayed with me. Pat says if you can demonstrate he's emotionally withdrawn and that you essentially ran everything, the super split is on the table. Just stick to that narrative and don't let him rattle you. Patricia Lamb was Colleen's solicitor. Derek had no business knowing her strategy. And yet, here he was, relaying it. Ron listened to the recording I brought him. He sat with his hands flat on his desk for a moment. Then he said, "This changes things considerably." Fiona did not know. That was the thing I kept coming back to in the long evenings in the spare room. My daughter, my quiet, careful daughter who still called me every Sunday morning and asked how I was eating, had no idea that the man she'd married was sitting in her parents' kitchen, coaching her mother through a financial strategy designed to diminish her father. I thought about telling her. Many times. I played out the conversation in my head. But every time I got to the part where she looked at me and had to decide what to believe, I stopped. I needed her to see it herself. I needed there to be no moment where she could think I had shaped her understanding for my own purposes. So I said nothing to Fiona. I was patient. I was, as Colleen had so accurately observed, apparently somewhere else entirely. The formal settlement meeting was scheduled for a Thursday morning in early August. Patricia Lamb's office in Maroochydore, glass-fronted, 3rd floor, looking out over the highway. Ron and I arrived together. Colleen and her solicitor were already there when we walked in. Colleen didn't look at me directly when I sat down. Derek, I noticed, had driven her. He was waiting in the car park below. I had seen his ute. As we'd pulled in, Patricia Lamb opened the meeting with a confident summary of her client's position. Colleen's contributions. The proposed split of the family home. The superannuation. a figure for spousal maintenance that made Ron's pen go still for a moment. Then, Patricia slid a document across the table. This is a proposed financial agreement. We'd ask Mr. Whitmore to review this with his solicitor and respond within 14 days. I looked at Ron. He looked at me. Before we get to that, Ron said pleasantly, "There are a few matters I'd like to put on the table." He opened his folder. What followed was the most controlled 45 minutes of my life. Ron presented the cash withdrawals, $12,000. Itemized by date. He presented the credit card records from Hervey Bay and Millennium. He presented a statutory declaration I had signed regarding the contents of the recordings, and a summary prepared carefully with legal advice of the conversations in which my wife had discussed her settlement strategy with a third party who had a direct conflict of interest. Given that party's relationship to a member of the family, he did not play the recordings in the room. He didn't need to. The summary was enough. Patricia Lamb's composure shifted in small but visible ways. A slight straightening. Her eyes moving to Colleen. Colleen, for the first time since I'd known her, had nothing to say. Her face had gone the color of old plaster. We would also note, Ron continued, still pleasantly, that the conduct we've documented may be relevant to our client's daughter, who we understand is currently unaware of certain matters pertaining to her husband's involvement in these proceedings. Colleen looked at me then. Really looked at me. For the first time in months. I looked back. I said nothing. Patricia Lamb asked for a recess. The recess lasted 20 minutes. When they came back, Patricia Lamb's confident summary had become something considerably more modest. The superannuation claim was withdrawn. The spousal maintenance figure was reduced to a number that Ron described afterward as reasonable. All things considered. The house was to be sold. The proceeds split, but on terms that reflected the Kingaroy land I'd inherited as a separate asset, which had never been properly Colleen's to claim. It was not a perfect outcome. No divorce is. But it was fair, which is all I had wanted from the beginning. I signed what needed to be signed. I shook nobody's hand. I walked out into the August sunshine and stood on the footpath and breathed the warm Brisbane corridor air for a long moment. Derek's ute was still in the car park. I walked past it without looking at it. The call from Fiona came 2 days later. Not Sunday. A Wednesday evening, which told me everything before she said a word. Dad. Her voice was careful the way it gets when she's trying not to cry. Can I come and see you? She arrived an hour later. I had the kettle on. She sat at my kitchen table. I was renting a unit in Caloundra by then, a small place close to the beach, and she wrapped both hands around her mug and stared at it. Derek told me there was a meeting, she said. He said your solicitor brought up some recordings. He said it was harassment, and it was designed to humiliate Mum. What do you think? I asked. She was quiet for a long time. I found some things, she said. On his phone. 3 weeks ago. I wasn't snooping, he left it open on the kitchen bench. I saw a message from Mum. She stopped. I haven't said anything to anyone, she said quietly. I didn't know what to do. You don't have to decide anything tonight, I said. You don't have to decide anything because of me. Did you know? Before the meeting? Yes. How long? About 2 months. She looked up at me. And you didn't say anything. To me, no. Why not? I thought about how to answer that honestly. Because it wasn't my thing to tell you. It was yours to find. I didn't want you looking back later and thinking I'd put the story in your head. She didn't say anything for a while. Then she started crying quietly, in the way that always broke my heart more than loud crying ever did, because it meant she was trying to hold it together for someone else's sake even when she was falling apart. I moved my chair around the table and I put my arm around her, and I didn't say anything. Because sometimes the most useful thing a father can do is simply be there and be solid. We sat like that for a long time. Colleen and I finalized the divorce in October. We have not spoken since the settlement meeting. I don't carry anger about that. I carry some sadness. The way you carry sadness for anything that was once good and then wasn't. 31 years is not nothing. She was not nothing. But people can love each other and still wrong each other badly. And it takes a certain clarity to hold both of those truths at once without letting one cancel out the other. Derek and Fiona separated in November. She moved back to the Sunshine Coast and found a rental in Mululaba, 10 minutes from me. We have Sunday breakfasts at the cafe on the esplanade now. She orders the smashed avo because she knows it amuses me, and I order the eggs and we drink too much coffee and watch the waves and talk about ordinary things. It is one of the best parts of my week. Marcus called from Perth when everything had settled. He's a steady man, my son, measured and fair. Not given to drama. He listened to the whole story without interrupting. And when I finished, he said, "You handled that really well, Dad. I mean that." I told him I didn't feel like I'd handled it well. I felt like I'd survived it, which is a different thing. Maybe, he said. But you didn't blow it up. You didn't do anything you'd regret. That counts for a lot. He was right. And I've thought about that since. I walk along the beach most mornings, now Caloundra Beach, just after 7, when the light is still soft and the serious swimmers are finishing up and the dog walkers are out in force. I live simply. I read more than I used to. I've been volunteering with a youth engineering program at a school in Landsborough, helping kids build small structures from everyday materials and learn why some things hold and others don't. I think about what I'd tell a younger version of myself, if I could. Not the 32-year-old in the Toowoomba pub. Necessarily he was fine. He was just beginning. Maybe the 55-year-old version. The one who had already started to feel the quiet settling in and told himself it was just the natural order of things. I'd tell him, pay attention. Not paranoid attention, not controlling attention, just the honest, present kind. The kind where you actually see what's in front of you rather than what you expect to see. The kind where you notice when a person's laugh has changed, or when someone who has no reason to be at your house keeps finding reasons to be there. I'd tell him that patience, when it comes from clarity rather than avoidance, is one of the most powerful things a person can bring to a difficult situation. That there is a difference between letting things go and letting things build until you are ready to address them with everything you need. I'd tell him that the instinct to protect people you love from painful truths is a good instinct, but it has to be balanced against their right to discover those truths for themselves. That the best thing I did through all of it was not the evidence I gathered or the meeting I prepared for it, was the night I didn't pick up the phone to call Fiona and tell her what I knew. Because she needed to find her own ground under her own feet, not ground I'd prepared for her. And I'd tell him the most important thing. The one I come back to on the beach in the mornings when the light hits the water just right, that what other people think of you, what they say about you when they think you're not listening, does not have to define how you move through the world. Colleen was wrong. I wasn't somewhere else. I was watching the whole time. I was calculating load, measuring stress, waiting for the right moment. I was exactly where I needed to be. If there's anything the past year has taught me, it's this. The truth does not need your help to surface. It rises on its own, in its own time, with or without your anger and your urgency. Your job, the only job that actually matters, is to be prepared when it does. To have your documents in order. Your integrity intact. Your relationships with the people who matter tended carefully enough to survive the earthquake when it comes. Trust slowly. Watch clearly. Act only when you are ready, not when you are simply in pain. And when someone tells you that you never notice anything, let them believe it. Sometimes the greatest advantage a person can have is being underestimated by the very people who should have known better.